So in part one, we had a very brief look at civil liberties, and this is a huge topic, and I didn't point it out last time, and I want to point it out here, that there are entire classes that you can take, upper-level classes, if you're going to go into law, if you're going to go into poli-sci, that are just on the Constitution, constitutional rights, and then civil liberties, which are usually two separate classes. So we are covering some huge ground here, so make sure that you're doing the rest of the reading. But I do want to come back, and we're going to kind of have a part two on this, to take a look at how this has kind of come out in practice. And to do this, we're going to focus on the First Amendment, and we're not even going to look at all of the First Amendment, because one of the things you have to understand is the Bill of Rights, there isn't like one civil liberty per amendment, right? So, free speech, one, done. There's actually a number of things, right? So out of the First Amendment, you get freedom of speech, you get the freedom of press, you get the freedom of assembly, you get the freedom of religion, both to and from, right? So there's all of these things that get packed in. So we're going to even just take a look at two of the major civil liberties that come out of the First Amendment. And the first, we're going to take a look, here's even the text of the phrase in the First Amendment in the Constitution. It says, quote, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech." But what specifically does that mean, right? So, we could talk about this for a minute. So if I'm hanging out and I'm eating my popcorn and all of a sudden I pop up and I start yelling, "Fire, fire," like when we're watching the Avengers or something and everybody's panicked and running around, is that protected speech? Is that what the Constitution is talking about, right? Because the language of the First Amendment is bold. It says, any speech. Can I say what I want to say? Yes, right? But what if I disseminate a flyer around campus that says that so-and-so is sleeping with me for grades, or with another professor, or with anybody, or doing something? In other words, I knowingly print lies about a student here on campus, right? Again, is that the kind of speech the speech talking about in the First Amendment? And so now that we understand that both the national government and the state governments may or may not be applicable to any particular Bill of Rights, the question becomes, how do we interpret these, right? What happens? And we know that the Supreme Court doesn't, because we've already learned the Constitution is what the courts say it is. And what we want to turn to first is, okay, what does it mean to have free speech? And the big case that deals with this is one called Brandenburg v. Ohio. It happens in 1969. And again, you'll notice most of these cases are very happy people. So like last time we had Frank Palka, who's going around and running and killing police officers. And here we're going to be dealing with the Ku Klux Klan rally. I once had a professor tell me, he said, look, you don't have Supreme Court cases about grandma baking cookies, right? So you're always going to be looking at some unusual cases, to just get used to that as we move forward. And what had happened is that the government had passed a law called the Criminal Syndicalism Law, And what that law said is you can't spread. He did other things, but one of the things he said was, you can't spread unpatriotic views. Yeah, so a little broad here, right? And so here's what happened. So Clarence Brandenburg is the big puma for the Ku Klux Klan in the Cincinnati, Ohio era. And they have a great big parade and a little party, right? As a matter of fact, this was not as unfamiliar as you might imagine in this area. And they invite a Cincinnati reporter to come see what was going on, kind of get in on this, report on the KKK. And while he's there, Brandenburg is going to make some speeches. And he's going to say some pretty forceful things. At one point he's going to say, this is Brandenburg speaking, quote, "We're not a revengeful organization, but if our president, our Congress, and our Supreme Court continues to suppress the white Caucasian race, it's possible that there might have to be some revengeance taken." Later he'll say, quote, "I personally believe that the well, he's going to use the N-word, should be returned to Africa, the Jew returned to Israel. And the government is going to prosecute him, but they're not going to prosecute him for the racism. That's going to be a topic that will lay dormant in this particular instance. And instead, we'll see he was citing unpatriotic views, and they're going to charge him under the Criminal Syndicalism Act. Oh, I'm sorry, not shared, charged. Under the Criminal Syndicalism Act. What the court is going to end up saying is, what the court is going to end up saying here is that states can't automatically forbid the use of force unless it's going to produce imminent lawless action. And that's more or less the test. The test has changed a little bit over time, but we're not going to go into that in intro class. But more or less, even today, your words have to produce some kind of immediate threat before they're not going to receive First Amendment protection. So you're going to see, you can do a lot of things, but eventually you can say something that's not going to receive First Amendment protection. Now, the second one I want to take a look at for just a minute is freedom of the press. It also comes out. And the First Amendment says that you can abridge the freedom of the press, so I can print when I want to print, right? Well, what about this? The two big kind of exceptions the court will early find are libel and slander. Libel is when you're writing something down untrue about somebody, and slander is when you're speaking something untrue about somebody. And we have two big cases that deal with this. We have New York Times v. Sullivan, which happens in '64, and we have Hustler Magazine versus Falwell, which happens in '88. Now, what happens is that in 1960, the New York Times is going to run a full-page advertisement paid for by civil rights activists. And the ad will openly criticize the police department of Montgomery, Alabama for its treatment of civil rights protesters. And this shouldn't be surprising given the era. If you kind of understand the era, this is the era of civil rights too. Many of the descriptions in the ad were accurate, but there's going to be a few statements that were false. And so Sullivan, who is the police commissioner, is going to sue for libel and argue that the New York Times has damaged his reputation because they printed things that were false. And what the Supreme Court said was that it is in fact protected because you have to look at the work as a whole. It wasn't meant to damage him. Most of it was true. And if little inaccuracies ended up making something libelous, well, then no one could ever do any reporting. So that's going to get struck down. Now, the next one is a little bit more, harsher. In this one, we get Hustler Magazine v. Falwell. And this happens in 1988. And there's kind of an interesting story that happens before and after this. Penthouse Magazine is going to publish this ad. And it's basically an interview about Jerry Falwell's first time. Now, this was a spoof on a campaign that was running for a particular kind of vodka at the time, Campari. And they had all of these ads about the first time for these different people. But the funny takeaway in the ads was it was always the first time with this vodka or with this alcoholic beverage. In this particular spoof of it, though, it's all about Falwell's first time, and if you take a look, it's pretty detailed, right? It indicates that Falwell is having sex with his mom while they're drunk in the outhouse, and that everything he believes is a bunch of BS. And Falwell is going to sue, and the Supreme Court here in Hustler Magazine v. Falwell is going to say no. Parody is not libel. It's obviously meant to be funny. You might not like what the person's talking about, but they're not actually libeling you per se. And this is huge. This is why you can have you can have the South Park and other kinds of cartoons like this happen. It's because you're allowed to have parody. And sometimes, very harsh parody, you know, Tom Cruise in the closets out there. So you get now. Interestingly enough, Falwell, who was a minister, and Larry Flint, who is the publisher of Hustler magazine, they will actually end up becoming friends as a result of this. They're going to fight, have kind of a big fight. They're going to disagree with each other. They're never going to agree with each other with the First Amendment rights, but they will end up becoming friends. So, civil liberties. Let's kind of sum up where we've been, because I know this is a tough one. Individuals are free from government coercion, right? A civil liberty is when you're free from a government individual. It's your ability to say no to something the government's doing, which means that it's a negative right. The specifics, as we can now see, get adjudicated. And this happens all the time. As a matter of fact, I said there's going to be all kinds of court cases that deal with this. And this forms a major part of the American political ethos. What does it mean to be free? What are the extents of your freedom? And this is a huge area of political science. But for our intro kind of class, we're going to have to leave it here for now. And we will be picking up next time with our next mini lecture.